The deed cost Thomas Vance $74, every cent he had left from his army pay, but the paper felt solid in his hand. It promised him 40 acres and a cabin in the high country of Colorado, miles from the nearest town of Stone Bluff. Solitude was what he was buying, a quiet buffer against a world that had grown too loud and too complicated. He rode his horse, a steady bay named Buck, up the winding game trail, the summer air thinning and growing crisp with the scent of pine and dry earth. The sun beat down, but up here, a breeze offered some relief. The cabin was exactly as the land agent had described it, abandoned. It sat in a small clearing, leaning into the mountain as if for support. The door hung on a single leather hinge, and dust lay thick as a blanket on the rough-hewn floorboards inside. It was small, just one room with a sleeping loft and a stone fireplace black with old soot. It was perfect. It was empty. But as he stepped over the threshold, the scent of stale air was wrong. Beneath the smell of dust and mice and decay, there was something else. Something clean. Something human. He stood perfectly still, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. A slight breeze ghosted through the open doorway, stirring the dust motes into a frantic dance. Buck snorted outside, impatient. Thomas's hand rested on the worn grip of the Colt Peacemaker at his hip, a habit from years he was trying to forget. Then he heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible creak from the sleeping loft above. It wasn't the groan of old wood settling. It was the sound of weight shifting. He wasn't alone. His voice was rough from disuse. "Come on down. I own this place now." Silence answered him. The dust mote settled. He could hear the frantic beat of a heart that was not his own. He let out a slow breath, trying to keep his voice even, stripped of threat. "I'm not going to hurt you. But you can't stay up there forever." More silence. Thomas walked over to the cold fireplace, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He ran a hand over the stone, feeling its grit. He was a patient man. He could wait. Finally, a whisper of movement from above, then the slow, hesitant scrape of wood on wood as a ladder was lowered from the loft. The first person to descend did so with a fluid grace that seemed out of place in the derelict cabin. She was a young woman, perhaps 22, with hair as black as a raven's wing pulled back in a severe knot. She wore a plain, high-collared dress of grey homespun cotton that looked foreign and old-fashioned. Her face was a mask of calm terror, her dark eyes fixed on him. Then a second woman appeared, identical to the first in every detail, from the shape of her eyes to the determined set of her jaw. She moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with the first. And then came a third, a perfect, living reflection of the other two. 3 of them. They stood together, a silent, unmovable unit in their identical grey dresses, their hands clasped in front of them. They looked like 3 porcelain dolls, beautiful and fragile and utterly, terrifyingly out of place. Thomas took his hand away from his pistol. This was not the kind of trouble he had expected. This was a different kind of danger altogether. The one in the middle, who seemed to be the leader, took a small step forward. Her English was hesitant, accented but clear. "We are sorry for trespass," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "We will leave." "Where will you go?" Thomas asked. The question was practical. The sun would be setting in a few hours, and the mountains were no place to be after dark without shelter or a fire. She did not answer, her eyes darting to her sisters. The one on her right looked down at the floor, while the one on her left kept her gaze fixed on Thomas, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "We heard the cabin was empty for a long time," the leader said. "We meant no harm." "I'm sure you didn't," Thomas said. He looked at their worn slippers, the lack of any bags or bundles. They had nothing. "You running from someone?" All 3 of them flinched at the question, a tiny, simultaneous movement that was more telling than any words. The defiant one's chin lifted a fraction. "We are running from no one," she said sharply. The leader placed a calming hand on her sister's arm. "My name is Lynn. These are my sisters, Mai and Sue. We are looking for a new place. Our family is in California." It was a lie, and not a very good one, but Thomas let it be. He was tired, the ride had been long, and his new life of solitude was already crowded with 3 silent, watchful ghosts. He could order them out. He could ride to Stone Bluff and tell the sheriff. Both were sensible options. Both felt wrong. He sighed, the sound loud in the tense quiet. The loft is yours for tonight. In the morning, we'll talk. He turned his back on them, a calculated risk, and walked out to unsaddle Buck. He did not see the look of stunned disbelief that passed between the 3 sisters. They had expected anger, violence, or to be cast out into the wilderness. They had not expected this quiet, weary acceptance. It was more unsettling than any threat. What he did not know was that this simple act of decency had just bought him a war he had no intention of fighting. An uneasy peace settled over the cabin for the next week. Thomas slept on the floor by the hearth, giving the sisters the loft. They were like mice, moving about with a quiet industry that slowly transformed the derelict space. They found a broom and swept away the years of dust. They used rags and creek water to scrub the floorboards and the single grime-covered window. They found a small patch of wild mint and herbs by the creek, and their scent began to chase away the cabin's musty smell. It turned out, could make a passable meal out of almost nothing. She combined his flour and beans with wild onions and roots she gathered, creating a savory stew that was a welcome change from the hardtack and jerky he'd been living on. Sue, the quietest of the 3, had a knack for mending. She took his torn shirt and, using a needle and thread from a small kit she produced from a hidden pocket, repaired it with stitches so small and neat they were nearly invisible. Lynn was the planner, directing their efforts with a few soft words, her eyes always watchful, always assessing. Thomas worked outside, repairing the corral fence and clearing the overgrown clearing. He watched them from the corner of his eye. He saw their resilience, the way they worked together without a wasted motion, a silent, efficient team. They never spoke of their past, and he never asked. The silence between them was a kind of truce, a fragile thing that could be shattered by a single wrong question. But his supplies were running low. He couldn't put it off any longer. He had to go to town. "I'm riding down to Stone Bluff," he announced one morning over a breakfast of corn cakes. "I'll be gone most of the day." 3 pairs of dark eyes snapped up to his. Fear, stark and undisguised, flashed across their faces before being quickly hidden. "Stay inside. Don't build a fire. Don't make a sound. If anyone comes up the trail, you hide in the loft and you don't come down. For any reason. You understand?" Lynn nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "We understand." The ride to Stone Bluff felt different this time. He was no longer just a man seeking solitude, he was a man with a secret. The town was little more than a single dusty street lined with a dozen clapboard buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a sheriff's office. As he tied Buck to the hitching post outside the general store, he saw them. 2 men stood on the boardwalk, smoking cigars. They didn't fit. They wore dark city suits, dusty from the trail but still jarringly out of place against the buckskin and denim of the locals. One was tall and thin with a face like a hawk. The other was shorter, built like a bulldog, with small, cold eyes that missed nothing. They were watching everyone who came and went, their gaze methodical and patient. Gunmen. Thomas felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He pushed his hat down and went inside. Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, gave him a curt nod. He gave her his list: flour, salt, coffee, bacon, and more beans than one man could possibly need. As she was measuring out the flour, the 2 men walked in. The bulldog-faced one, whose name he would later learn was Boone, approached the counter. His voice was polite, but it had an edge like a newly sharpened knife. "Morning, he said to Mrs. Gable. "My partner and I are looking for some information. We're looking for 3 Chinese girls. Young. Ran away from their family in San Francisco. Might have passed through here." Mrs. Gable's expression didn't change. "Can't say I've seen anyone like that. Not much traffic through Stone Bluff." "They're identical," Boone pressed. "You'd remember if you saw them." Like I said, she repeated, her voice flat. Haven't seen them. The man's cold eye swept the store and landed on Thomas. He noted the size of Thomas's order being packed into burlap sacks. That's a lot of supplies for one man, Boone observed, his tone conversational. Thomas didn't look at him. Winter's coming eventually, he said to Mrs. Gable. You're new here, aren't you? The hawk-faced man, Fletcher, chimed in. Bought the old Miller place up on the mountain, I hear. Thomas finished paying, his movements deliberate. That's right. Lonely up there, Boone said, a faint smile playing on his lips. A man might take in strays, just for the company. Thomas picked up his sacks. He finally met Boone's gaze. I like my own company just fine. He walked out of the store, the weight of the supplies a heavy burden, but the weight of the gunman's suspicion was heavier still. He loaded the sacks onto Buck, his hand steady despite the tremor running through him. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was not over. The men were hunters, and they had caught a scent. The ride back was tense. Every rustle in the trees, every shadow that fell across the trail, made him reach for his pistol. He took a longer, harder route, pushing Buck through a narrow, rocky canyon that was a treacherous shortcut. He had a strong feeling he was being watched, and he needed to be sure he wasn't leading trouble straight to his door. By the time he reached the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, and he was covered in dust and scratches from the dense undergrowth. The sisters rushed out when they heard him approach, their faces pale with worry. As he unloaded the supplies, Mai noticed a long, deep scratch on his forearm, beaded with blood. Before he could wave it off, she disappeared into the cabin and returned with a small wooden bowl containing a green, pulpy mash. Sit, she commanded, her voice soft but firm. He was too tired to argue. He sat on the porch steps as she carefully cleaned the wound and applied the poultice. It was cool and soothing. What is it? He asked, looking at the strange green paste. Herbs, Lynn answered for her, standing in the doorway. She knows the old ways. It will stop the bleeding and keep it from festering. Thomas looked at Mai's capable hands, then at Lynn's watchful eyes, and at Sue, who stood just behind her, holding a clean strip of cloth for a bandage. They were not helpless. They were not fragile dolls. They were survivors. He had gone to town to provide for them, but in this small, quiet way, they were now caring for him. The realization settled deep within him. He was no longer just their protector. They were in this together. And he knew with a grim certainty that the gunmen in their dark suits would not be satisfied with the storekeeper's denials. They would be coming up the mountain soon. That night, the fragile truce of silence in the cabin finally broke. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Thomas stared into the flames of the small fire he'd built, the herbal bandage on his arm a strange comfort. He could feel their eyes on him. He had to know what he was up against. Tell me everything, he said, his voice low, not looking at them. Who are those men in town? Who sent them? The sisters exchanged a look. It was Lynn who finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper, as if saying the words aloud would give them a terrible power. They work for our father. Your family in California, Thomas said, the words tasting like ash. It hadn't been a complete lie, then. Lynn shook her head, a bitter smile touching her lips. He is not family. He is our owner. His name is Han, and he is a powerful man in San Francisco. He deals in people. He provides labor gangs for the railroads, for the mines. Men who are trapped by debt and false promises. He controls them with fear. She paused, gathering her strength. Mai placed a comforting hand on her sister's back. Our mother died when we were very young. For a time, we were allowed to live in peace. We learned to read, to write, to manage a household. But when we came of age, he saw us not as daughters, but as assets. The story spilled out, a torrent of quiet misery. Their father had arranged their marriages. Not to respectable merchants or scholars, but to three of his most ruthless business partners, men known for their cruelty. The marriages were a business deal, a way to seal an alliance and reward his lieutenants. The sisters would be nothing more than property, passed from one master to another. We would have been prisoners, Sue whispered, speaking for the first time since he'd met her. Her voice was like the rustle of dry leaves. Worse than prisoners. They had planned their escape for months, aided by an elderly cook who had known their mother and pitied them. They saved what little money they could, sewing it into the hems of their dresses. The cook arranged for them to be hidden in the back of a freight wagon heading east, giving them directions to this remote, abandoned cabin he had heard of from a prospector. They had been hiding here for a month before Thomas arrived. As Lynn finished speaking, Sue reached into the folds of her dress. She carefully unwrapped a small square of faded red silk. Inside lay 3 small pendants, carved from a pale green jade. Each was a perfect, tiny circle with a delicate flower etched into its center. From our mother, Lynn explained, her voice thick with emotion. It is all we have of her. It is all we have of a life before him. Thomas looked at the small, precious objects, glowing softly in the firelight. They were more than just jewelry, they were a symbol of a life that had been stolen, and a future they were fighting to claim. The secret was out now, lying in the small space between them, heavy and dangerous. He was no longer just harboring runaways. He was sheltering fugitives from a man who treated human beings like cattle and had the power to send killers across a territory to retrieve his property. 2 days later, they came. Thomas was splitting wood when he heard the horses. Not the sound of a single rider, but 2, moving with a confidence that meant they weren't lost. He straightened up, axe in hand, and saw them at the edge of the clearing. Fletcher and Boone. They sat on their horses, just beyond his property line, watching him. They weren't trying to be stealthy. This was an announcement. He had told the sisters what to do. At the first sign of trouble, they were to go to the loft, pull up the ladder, and stay silent. He knew they were up there now, watching through the cracks in the floorboards, their hearts pounding. Thomas leaned the axe against the woodpile and wiped his hands on his trousers. He didn't reach for his gun. Not yet. He walked slowly toward the front of the cabin, stopping on the small, rickety porch. "Morning," he said, his voice calm. Fletcher smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "Mr. Vance. We'd like a word." "You're having one," Thomas replied. "No need for unpleasantness," Boone said, his voice deceptively mild. He swung down from his horse. Fletcher remained mounted, his hand resting on his thigh, inches from his pistol. "We know they're in there. Mr. Han in San Francisco is a very reasonable man. He just wants his property returned. No harm done. He'll even pay you for your trouble." The word hung in the air between them. Property. It was a brand, a cage, a denial of everything the 3 women in the loft were. Thomas felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. He had come to these mountains seeking peace, an escape from the choices and conflicts of the world. But the world had followed him up the trail. He could lie. He could say the sisters had been here but left days ago, heading north. The men might even believe him. It was the sensible choice, the safe choice. It would get them off his land. But then he thought of the 3 faces, so alike but so distinct. Lynn's fierce intelligence, Mai's quiet compassion, Sue's watchful spirit. He thought of the mended shirt, the herbal poultice, the small jade pendants. They were not property. He looked squarely at Boone. "There's no property here that belongs to a Mr. Han," he said, his voice level and clear. The words felt solid, like stones being laid for a foundation. "This is my land. You're trespassing." Boone's mild expression vanished. His eyes went flat and dead. "That is the wrong answer, friend." He made his move, a blur of speed, his hand dropping to the gun at his hip. But Thomas had been expecting it. He had spent years learning to read the intentions of men like this. He didn't draw his own weapon. Instead, he kicked over a heavy wooden rain barrel at the edge of the porch. It crashed to the ground, a loud, startling crack that made Boone's horse shy violently. Fletcher fought to control his mount, his attention diverted for a critical second. It was the opening Thomas needed. But it wasn't for a fight. It was for a signal he had prayed would arrive. From the trees on the far side of the clearing, a voice boomed, "Drop your weapons." U.S. Marshal. Two men in dusty coats stepped out from the cover of the pines, rifles leveled. A third man, older, with a grey moustache and a silver star pinned to his vest, walked calmly into the clearing. Marshal Abernathy. Fletcher and Boone froze, caught completely by surprise. They were good hunters, but they had been so focused on their prey, they never realized they were being hunted themselves. Their hands went up. After his trip to town, Thomas hadn't been idle. He'd ridden to a telegraph station 10 miles east, a risky detour. He'd sent a message to Marshal Abernathy in the county seat, a man he'd served with briefly years ago, a man he knew to be steady and honest. He described Fletcher and Boone and his suspicions about their purpose. It turned out the marshal was already looking for two men matching their description in connection with a stagecoach robbery. Thomas's message had given him a location. The gamble had paid off. For months later, the mountain air had a sharp, cold edge to it. The aspens in the valley had turned a brilliant, trembling gold. The cabin no longer looked abandoned. The chimney, newly chinked with clay and stone, sent a steady plume of pale smoke into the crisp autumn sky. A sturdy new corral housed buck and a gentle-eyed milk cow. Beside the cabin, a small garden, covered now against the first frosts, showed the remnants of a successful harvest. The immediate threat of Fletcher and Boone was long gone. In federal custody, they had talked, hoping for leniency. Their testimony, combined with a detailed account from the sisters, had given Marshal Abernathy enough to build a federal case against Mr. Han for illegal labor practices and conspiracy. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but for the first time, the sisters were not running. They had been granted territorial protection as witnesses. They were free. That freedom had transformed them. They were no longer three identical figures in grey. Lynn, with a sharp mind for numbers, managed their small homestead, trading their surplus butter and cheese in town and keeping a meticulous ledger. Mai had proven to have a miraculous touch with plants and animals, her garden and the milk cow thriving under her care. And Sue, the quiet observer, had revealed a surprising talent for tanning hides, turning deer and rabbit skins into soft, durable leather which she stitched into gloves and winter moccasins. The town of Stone Bluff had changed, too. The story of the standoff at the Vance cabin had spread, growing with each telling. Thomas was no longer seen as just a reclusive newcomer. He was the man who had faced down two hired guns without blinking. Respect, in the West, was a currency earned through action, and he had paid in full. Mrs. Gable from the general store now made a point to ask after the Han sisters, trading them sugar and coffee for Mai's herbal remedies. Suspicion had slowly, grudgingly, given way to a kind of acceptance. Thomas sat on the repaired porch, watching the late afternoon sun set the western peaks ablaze. He had come here for solitude, to empty his life of complications. He had failed completely. His life was now profoundly, wonderfully complicated. The cabin door opened, and Lynn stepped out, carrying two steaming mugs. She handed one to him. It was filled with a fragrant tea brewed from the mint that grew by the creek. She stood beside him, her shoulder almost touching his, as they watched the last light fade from the sky. They didn't need to speak. In the months they had worked side by side, building this new life from nothing, they had learned a language that didn't require words. His gaze drifted to the wall just inside the open door. The 3 jade pendants hung there from a leather cord, catching the last of the light. They were no longer a symbol of a life they had lost, but a promise of the one they were building. He had come to this mountain seeking an absence of people, a quiet place to forget. Instead, he had found a home, not in the empty land, but in the steadfast presence of the people who now filled it. He had learned that a man's strength wasn't measured by how much he could endure alone, but by the courage it took to stand with others when the world tried to tear them down. And in that shared courage, he had finally found the peace he'd been looking for. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.